Well, we'd like to welcome you for lesson number 7, and that's titled The Return. Now, the Bible, the Protestant Bible, is basically the last writings are around 400 BC. And we go for a period of about 400 years where the Bible, Protestant Bible, seems to skip any recordings or messages. And the reason for this is Christianity is known as the historical faith, or meaning God reveals us through the events of history. And the writings that are in the Catholic Church Bible for the last 400 years are dreams or visions. The authorship of these dreams or visions is uncertain. And when Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, he removed those writings in the Catholic Bible that were the dreams and visions for several reasons. One, we weren't sure of the authorship or the accuracy of these writings. The second reason is the church in the time of Martin Luther were using these dreams and visions to frighten people as a way of controlling them and raising funds for the Sistine Chapel that they were building. Now, these collection of the writings are in the Catholic Bible and not in the Protestant Bible are often called the Apocrypha. And you'll find many Protestant Bibles that will have an appendix called the Apocrypha. These are the writings that are the dreams and visions during the last 400 years before the coming of Christ. Most people don't realize that there are actually two different Bibles, and that is because in the Protestant faith, each individual is challenged to read the Bible themselves. And so therefore, you go into a Protestant home and you'll find Bibles generally everywhere. Where in the Catholic Church, the emphasis is not on the individual to read the Bible, but to remember what the church says about the Bible. And therefore, the Catholic Bibles sales are only a fraction of what the Protestant Bibles are. And therefore, in many Christian bookstores and other secular bookstores, you will only find the Protestant Bible actually for sale. Now, as we get ready to come to the time of these last 400 years, all the influence on the Middle East has been coming from the East. The Babylonians came from the East. The Mesopotamians came from the East. The Persians came from the East. And so it basically was the Eastern culture up to the time of the Greek invasion that was influenced the culture and thought of people of that day. And even today, we find a tremendous difference between the culture of many of the Asian nations and the culture of what we would call those nations influenced by the Western European outlook of life. And that was true back then also. Back then, the importance was of the worship of ancestors. You seek to live in harmony with nature. You seem to live in harmony with the universal soul. And one tended to surrender to the flow of life instead of trying to rule over life. This would change dramatically, as we'll discover in just a few minutes, with the arrival of Greeks and the Greek emphasis on the mind instead of harmony with that around you. Also, cultural development during this period of time, the Hebrews was very limited because of Hebrew beliefs. For one, if you were sick, you turned to God for healing. Therefore, there was not much of an emphasis on physicians or what we would call secular medicine of the day. Most sculptures and carvings in those days were to make idols for worship. And so idols and images were forbidden by the Hebrews. Art was very primitive among the Hebrew people. Same because of religious beliefs, drama or theater was not done among the Hebrew people. It seemed like, in fact, the only art form that was really advanced with the Hebrew people was storytelling. Now, this last 400 years before coming of Jesus was also a very insecure time. There will be not, in the last 400 years, there will be 9 major invasions of the Holy Land. That means about once every 50 years, another empire would come in, destroy the cities, destroy the crops. There would be hunger, starvation, a new set of enslavement and taxes. People may wonder, well, why wouldn't they accept Jesus as the Messiah? Well, the fact was, from writings we have, in the last 100 years before Jesus, there were 12 major popular false messiahs that huge groups of Hebrews would follow, believing this was the Messiah. 12 different times. It was no wonder they were reluctant to believe in another possible Messiah after so many disappointments. As I said earlier, one of the greatest changes occurs when Alexander the Great invades this area. And for the first time, the influence among the Hebrew people is coming from the west instead of the east. The emphasis now is not on the soul of creation or the soul of the universe, it's on the mind. That's the most important part of the body. Logic becomes important. You do not, the emphasis now is not to turn to God for your answers, but to turn to your own mind for the answers. The emphasis was now that we're not at the mercy of God, but in fact, humankind can now control the world instead of surrendering to it. Meaning that we now can control our destiny, and we can then to be at the mercy of the powers of the world or of the gods. It was believed now, as with Plato and Socrates, human beings can create the perfect world. We no longer have to turn to a God for that. Now, the Greeks would only rule for about 80 to 90 years, but their influence would remain throughout the Roman Empire era because of their strong influence on the Roman Empire. Anything to do with government or politics was written in Latin. However, anything to deal with wisdom, with the arts, would be written in Greek. And therefore, the writings of the Bible weren't first written in Latin. They would be written in Greek, and then they would be translated into Latin during the Middle Ages. Now, prior to the coming of the Greeks into the Middle East, 90% of the Hebrew people lived within 1 day of the temple, meaning they could get to the temple for the Sabbaths, they could get there for all the religious holidays. It meant that most of them were secluded in their own little private world, separated from the trade routes up north, their interaction with other groups of people. But with the coming of the Greeks, and then later followed by the Romans, there was a whole new security to the West. And so therefore, you can now travel with safety throughout the Mediterranean area. And with this, the Hebrew people, especially as Hebrews became more and more involved in commerce, began to also move to the West. And it got to the point that the majority now of the Hebrew people no longer lived within one day of the temple. They couldn't make it for the Sabbath, and many of them were now living so far away they couldn't even make it back for the holidays. So how do you hold on to a Hebrew faith if you can't get back to the temple? And so what we saw being developed was the synagogues. Now the synagogues are totally different than the temple. The temple was meant to be the place to do sacrifice to God. It is the only place you could sacrifice to God. Synagogues today would be more like our Sunday school programs in churches. It was to gather the Hebrews of a certain area and to go educate them on the writings of their faith, the 10 Commandments. In fact, the service was a man would get up and read some of the laws, and then there would be a discussion of the laws, those laws. It was a way to try to hold on to one's faith, even though you couldn't be by the temple any longer. Now, what this did, however, was create two different types of religious leadership during the 400 years before coming to Jesus came. One was the Sadducees. The Sadducees were basically the priests who operated the temple. They got their income from the sacrifices in the temple. Most of them were raised in the area of Jerusalem. They spent their whole lives in the area of Jerusalem. They were in a life really of isolation from the rest of the world. On the other hand, the synagogues were operated by what were called Philistines. Philistines were known more as the purpose of the synagogue as teachers. They were not, the emphasis was not on the sacrifices because they couldn't do them. Second of all, they weren't as committed to the laws because they couldn't observe the religious holiday, Sabbath every day, every week in the temple, or they couldn't get to the temple for the observance of the holidays. Also, since they were away from South Israel, they were more intermingled with the culture and the variety of people, both from the west and the east, because of the trade routes and commerce. So I guess you would say today that the Sadducees were the conservatives and the Pharisees were the liberals. Also, the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. And you see, there will be those who challenged, if they're challenging Jesus about the resurrection, it's the Sadducees. Pharisees, on the other hand, did believe in the resurrection. Now, we'll be getting shortly into the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we find that one of the most influential evangelists is Paul. Now, Paul was a Pharisee. However, as we find out, Paul was a Sadducee. And as he committed his life to living every single law. And he was that until his road to experience with encounter of Jesus on the road to Damascus. He would turn later to become one of the greatest evangelists. And he was the crusader that when the disciples met in Jerusalem to decide, do you have to be a Jew before you could be a Christian? It was Paul and Peter that convinced them, no, you don't have to be. You can be a Gentile and become a Christian. And that, of course, we know quickly it would be the Gentiles that would make the vast majority of the new Christian movement, not necessarily Hebrews. Now, however, Paul's most influential group of people that he was able to bring to Christ is what we were, those who we would call proselytes. Now, proselytes were Gentiles who were impressed with the Hebrew faith, the Hebrew God. But you can't become a Hebrew until you went to the basin at the temple and was baptized. And we'll see that basin next week as I show the slides. And of course, most of the Gentiles lived away from the temple. They couldn't get to the temple, so they could never officially become Hebrews. They were required in the synagogues to sit in the back. But it would turn out these would be the ones most open to the message of Paul and be the ones that Paul would end up converting. Now, following the Greeks come the Romans. Now, Romans gained control of the Holy Land just a little less than a century before Jesus was born. It would not be a quiet time. There were constant uprisings by the Hebrews, the priests or Sadducees, in order to maintain the comfortable life they had, agreed to work along with the Romans, which made the other Hebrews even angrier than them standing up against them. Now, about 30 years before the birth of Jesus, Herod become the ruler of the area. Now, there's two Herods. There's the Herod at the birth of Jesus, and then there's a Herod at the death of Jesus. The one who was birth of Jesus dies when Jesus is about 6 or 7. So it is same name, but two different Herods. The birth Herod, his mother was a Hebrew. Now, the Roman rulers over the Hebrews up to this period of time had very short lifespans. Because all Rome was concerned with by the rulers, they could keep peace. What they couldn't keep was peace. And so therefore, every few years, the ruler in this area would be invited to retirement, permanent retirement. Well, when Herod became ruler, that's the last thing he wanted, was to be offered permanent retirement. His mom was a Hebrew. And therefore, he figured a way that he could get the support of the Hebrews. There would be peace, and he could he would be able to find a life insurance salesman who would really be willing to sell him a life insurance policy. And that was for him to quadruple the size of the Temple Mount. Now, he will do this, but it takes about 20 years to build it. And we'll go through all the statistics and the size and everything, and you'll be able to visually see it next week as we show the slides. how it is considered one of the 10 wonders of the ancient world. And if there was a space station at that time, just like the space station could see the wall of China, the space station would be able to see the Temple Mount because of its huge size. Now, the other thing we need to remember is the Hebrews and Romans do not mix. The Romans felt all these Hebrew laws and rules were a bunch of nonsense. They didn't want to cope with them. And so what happens is when Rome took over the area, they let the crazy Hebrews off by themselves in the towns and the villages they had, and they created their own towns for them to be in, where they could have the fun and the orgies and everything else that was forbidden by the Hebrews. Now, at this time, during the several hundred years before, and even during the first 2 centuries after the birth of Jesus, the fastest growing religion at the time was not Christianity, but was a religion called Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is a lot like today what you would call universalists. And what that meant is you believed in a God, but it didn't matter how you believed it, what you did, or how you practiced. Everybody could become a Christian could become a Gnostic, a Hebrew could become a Gnostic. The Romans worshiping many gods could become Gnostics. You entered the movement by acting out a secret drama. And this drama would reveal the secret truths. In fact, there's many experts who believe Paul may have been a Hebrew Gnostic before his conversion. Now, Gnosticism tried to absorb the Christian faith into its movement. And it was the early founding fathers, which including Paul, who took a strong stand against it. And this is why even today, especially some conservative Christian movements, there's a strong stand against, quote, secret societies or secret movements. It comes all the way back from the secrecy of the Gnostic movement, which was the main competitor with Christianity back in those first centuries. Now, it's said today that if you have 3 Hebrews, you have 4 ideas. And that was no different at the time of Jesus. Among the Hebrews in those 400 years before and during the life of Jesus, there were many different types of divisions of Hebrew people. There were the Zealots or Maccabeans, who believed that the Messiah would come once the Romans were eliminated. And therefore, they led numerous rebellions against the Romans. And unfortunately, as a result, many of the innocent Hebrews were punished because of these actions by the Zealots or Maccabeans. Now, they would be more up in the northern part of what we would call today Israel. The other group was the Sadducees, who controlled the temple, and their whole emphasis was on the law. The rules that Moses brought, the 10 Commandments and the 400 laws that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, and all the human interpretations of those laws. It is said a man could spend his whole life just studying all the interpretations of just one of those 400 laws. They were, as I said before, very conservative because very few of them lived outside of Jerusalem. Then there were the Pharisees, who were the leaders of the synagogue. And to them, what was so important, it was not keeping the law, but the way you lived. Give you an example, if you were a Sadducee, you were in love with the book of Exodus. If you were a Pharisee, you probably read more of the laws of the prophets than the book of Exodus. More about living and not just knowing the law. And as I said before, they would be the liberal ones because they would be living outside of Jerusalem. They would be mixed in with all the other cultures of the area. And then there is what's called the Essenes. The Essenes believed the world was going to the devil. Anybody feel like we're heading that way today? And they would live in the wilderness outside of Jerusalem and create their own communities. Many of you may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a collection of sacred writings, which was the library of the Essenes out in the wilderness. And they kept them in the caves, and because of the coolness and dryness of the caves, they were pretty well preserved. Now, it's believed that John the Baptist was an Essene. He lived out in the wilderness. Most of his ministry was done there in the wilderness. By the way, just to help you be able to digest your food tonight, we read many times that John ate locusts. Now, when they said John ate locusts, it's not those insects. There is a locust tree that has bean pods about the size of our string beans. And that's the locust he was eating. So you can, your stomach doesn't have to be quite so squirmy when you read about John eating locusts. It's more of a vegetable than an insect. So this brings us to a conclusion of the time just prior to the coming of Jesus, between the return of the Hebrew people after the Persians took control and the king allowed them to go back, and the birth of Jesus. Next week, we'll be looking at exactly the moment Jesus is born, and most of the time we'll be looking at slides of the temple. So when you hear all the different references in the New Testament about different areas of the temple, you'll be able to know what they're talking about. We also will be happy to answer questions you may have from studying the Old Testament part. So write your questions and please bring them with you next week. Thank you for joining us today. Bye.